Velkommen og god dag alle sammen. Today we are speaking a little bit about how some pagan things have survived, specifically magic I'm talking about here, after the official Christianization. So we know that a lot of pagan things survived after the official Christianization of Scandinavia around the year 1000, depending on which country. We know how pagan songs, prayers, traditions, holidays, and other things like that survived 1,000 years after the official Christianization of Scandinavia. Paganism never died out. We're 1,000 years after now, and we still have pagan things that we're doing. Halloween, Christmas, just to name a couple there. I still see a lot of people doubting and talking about, if you find a magic spell after the year 1000, it's not pagan at all. Scandinavia became Christian in the year 1000, and anything after that is Christian magic. Well, just shut up and listen, okay? And I'm going to show you how a lot of it can be pagan. And to do this, we will need to look at the history of the poetic edda, or the Codex Regius, is what we're really going to look at here as proof for that. So really what the poetic edda is the Codex Regius. It's a manuscript that we find most of the works in what we know as the poetic edda today. It's a whole bunch of poems, Völuspá, Havamal, Grimnismal, there are a few. So most of you know that it was written in the 1200s, but all scholars agree that the Codex Regius was comprised of poems that were much, much older than that. So most of these poems could have been comprised hundreds of years before they were actually written down. They were composed in pagan times. So we know that most of these are written by pagans in pagan times and reflected their beliefs, and they were just passed down orally and written down sometime in the 1200s by the Christian priests. We all know this. But let's talk about a few things that most of you don't know about the Poetic Edda, because there are a few very important things that we can learn from what we actually don't know. The first thing that you probably don't know, the Poetic Edda, or the Codex Regius, was actually missing. It was missing. No one knew where it was until 1643. So it was written down in the 1200s. I think it was around the year 1270, and then it was hidden away for more than almost 400 years. At that time is when the bishop Brynjolfur Sveinsson, he found it in his church or cathedral or something like that. So these stories and myths and poems, before that, they were absolutely lost for 400 years. So the Codex Regius is pretty much the only text that exists that tells us about the native pagan beliefs. There are a couple of other works like the Prose Edda and some skaldic poems and other version of some of the things in the Poetic Edda, but these were all hidden away too somewhere. They were lost until the mid-1600s, and where no one from the general public could read anything about old pagan beliefs. So this brings me to my most important point here. People of Scandinavia passed down these pagan traditions and poems and prayers and songs and magic. They passed them down orally for hundreds of years after the official Christianization. Okay, these were pagan things preserved orally because they had no place to read about it. This wasn't something like we can do today. We're in the year 2020. We have something we can look back on. We have the Poetic Edda we can find. We have all these different things on the internet. We can find all of these ancient things, and then we can read about them and form our beliefs that way and incorporate them into our lives. But back in the Middle Ages, you could not do that. Now I say this because there are a lot of songs and magic spells, traditions, and things like that we see recorded use of in Scandinavia from the 1400s all the way up until the 1900s, and magic books and a lot of other traditional books like that. But there are a lot of skeptics looking at these magic spells and songs and traditions, and they say, oh, these are not pagan, these are Christian. Scandinavia wasn't pagan at this time, so these spells and songs and prayers cannot be pagan. And even though they say this still, even though some of these songs and magic and prayers have a direct reference or prayer to the Norse gods. Then the skeptics say, those are just made up in Christian times, and they put the old Norse gods in there in that prayer. And, that's all bullshit. They don't know what they're talking about. Look, the Scandinavian people would have had no idea. If it wasn't for oral tradition being passed down, the Scandinavian people would have no idea who the Norse gods were in the 1500s and onwards. They did not have any books or libraries where they could read about the Norse gods and pagan traditions. And even after the Codex Regius was found in Iceland, it was sent to Denmark and kept private for another few hundred years, actually. And around this time, there were no printing presses, there were no bookshops, there were no magazine publishers, so someone could copy down this Codex Regius and spread it to all over and every little small village in Scandinavia. It just did not work like that. People could not read about the old beliefs. There were no texts. There wasn't anything to really read or learn about the old beliefs. So it would have not been possible for the regular Scandinavian person to read about the old myths and then create some reconstructed pagan magic thing hundreds of years after. So this means one thing: if we find a prayer or song or magical spell that involves the Norse gods any time from about the 1300s, we start finding them up until the 1900s, and there are lots of these actually, then we can say that there's a very, very good chance that it was originally a pagan song or prayer passed down orally. It may be developed, of course, and changed with time, but this wasn't something that they could just make up. It would have been passed down orally and pretty privately, actually. Remember, these were all very illegal at the time. If you were caught doing a pagan ritual or pagan tradition, you would have been killed or exiled or something like that. So if we see something pagan that has very, very much pagan characteristics, if we find that, say, the 1600s, for example, like when a lot of these magic books were first written, we can say pretty much for sure that at least it has some type of pagan origin. It may not have been the exact same spell that was used in pagan times, but it had developed and it had a pagan original form. So let's just look at something that you can compare it to make you understand a bit better. So if you look back, say, a few hundred years, say we're in the 1700s, every man pretty much knew how to hunt an animal, skin it, he knew how to cut it, take away the inedible parts, store it, cook it properly, and everything about it. We knew the whole process here. Now let's go back 100 years. Let's go back to the year 1920, and most men didn't know how to do this anymore. If they tried, they would end up probably cutting themselves or doing something wrong or letting the meat spoil, or they would get sick from it. They would eat some inedible part of the meat. And in the 1920s, probably around that time, it got to a point where only butchers knew how to really cut up an animal and preserve it like that. Now let's look at today in the year 2020. Nobody knows how to do it. Even butchers, they don't know how to do it. We have factory farming, and each person does their job. One slaughters the animal, one skins it, one divides it, one cuts it, one person packs it, one guy inspects it, and then one guy transports it and stores it. But there's not one person that knows how to do the whole package. There's maybe a few people, of course, that know how to do this still in the year 2020, but I guarantee that in 100 years we will be totally helpless, and the art of butchering will be completely lost, and there won't be a single person who knows how to do it. We'll just have a factory to do all that for us, unfortunately, and the average person won't know how to butcher an animal, and we wouldn't even know where to go to learn it because we're not passing this knowledge down onto future generations. We're just letting a factory handle it. So pagan magic and traditions would have been the exact same thing. there was no place that these people could go read about it. There was no place that they could go and publicly learn it. But still, we find hundreds and hundreds of magic books and spells and prayers that involve the Norse gods and have really strong pagan characteristics. Why? It's because these things were passed down orally onto the next generations. Simple as that. And I'll admit it, many of these magic spells and songs and prayers that we find in the Scandinavian magic books are not pagan. I'll admit there's a big chunk of them that are not pagan. They're either Christian or Jewish or something else. That's what happened when different cultures came together. They created magic and they kind of mixed it all together into one. However, there are dozens or perhaps hundreds that 100% sure come from pagan times. And this is what I do on this channel. I go over all of these types of things, all of these magic spells, and try to determine if they're pagan or not, if they have pagan origins. We can't just say that any spell found after the year 1000 is not pagan, because that's just not true. There's some that are going to be, and then some that are not. We have to look at each one individually, and that's my point saying this video. And look forward to some magical spells that I'm going to be going over in future videos. Vi ses nästa gång.